The will of one Bernard Redmayne, late of Stormbridge, contained a single clause that no one at Thornwick Hall had thought to read carefully, and it was that clause which undid every comfortable assumption Sir Percival Redmayne had been building his rescue plan upon for the better part of 6 months. I should tell you what it said, because it matters enormously to everything that follows, and because I have sat beside enough fires in my years to know that when someone rushes past the legal particulars, the particulars always come back for them later, usually at the worst possible moment. Bernard Redmayne had been a prosperous man. Timber merchant, careful investor, the kind of bachelor uncle who appears at Christmas with expensive gifts and quietly disapproves of his brother-in-law's habits with money. He had died without children, and his will, drawn up by a thorough solicitor in Edinburgh, left the whole of his timber estate, the land, the income, the contracts, the inventory, to the eldest daughter born of my sister Catherine's marriage, upon the occasion of that daughter's marriage to a gentleman of established good standing, the eldest daughter, not a daughter, the eldest. Sir Percival Redmayne had 2 daughters, one was 26, one was 21. The elder was named Phoebe. Sir Percival had not thought of Phoebe in connection with the timber estate, because Sir Percival, if we are being honest with each other about the man, had not thought of Phoebe in connection with much of anything requiring imagination for a very long time. She ran his house, she kept his accounts, she managed the tenants' disputes and ordered the winter stores and ensured that the chimneys were swept before October, because if you let October get past you in Hartfall, said Phoebe Redmayne, with the quiet authority of a woman who had learned this the expensive way, you would be cold until April, and cold cost money they did not have. She was the mechanism by which Thornwick Hall remained standing. She was simply not, in her father's estimation, the sort of woman a man of consequence would come to claim. His other daughter, Annalise, was the sort of woman men came to claim. She had honey-coloured hair, and a laugh that carried across a garden, and the particular gift of making every person she spoke to feel, briefly and completely, as though they were the most interesting soul she had ever encountered. She was not dishonest, she was not unkind. She had simply been taught from infancy, by the consistent signal of every admiring glance and every murmured compliment, that her value lived in her face, and she had drawn the only sensible conclusion available to a girl raised on that lesson, that the face must be deployed wisely, and soon, before time began to renegotiate the terms. So when the letter arrived from the offices of Forster and Bryce, solicitors to the Earl of Caulfield, requesting a marriage arrangement between Lord Griffith Caulfield and a daughter of Sir Percival Redmayne's household, Sir Percival read the phrase "a daughter" and understood it, without a moment's hesitation, to mean Annalise. He did not read Bernard's will again. He did not ask his solicitor to clarify the inheritance terms. He simply wrote back that the arrangement was agreeable and began deciding which guest rooms to air. He did not mention any of this to Phoebe. She found out the way she found out most things that happened in her own house, by doing the work that needed doing. She had gone to her father's study to file the quarterly accounts, which she had prepared and which he would sign without reading, as was their long-standing arrangement, and there on the desk, beneath a half-finished glass of port and an overdue notice from his tailor, was the letter from Forster and Bryce. She read it standing, with the accounts tucked under her arm, and the afternoon punt light coming grey through the window. She understood the implications immediately, which should surprise no one who knew her. She also understood, and this is the part I want you to sit with for a moment, that her father had not told her because it had not occurred to him that she was relevant. Not from cruelty, simply because, in the economy of his imagination, an earl arriving to negotiate a marriage was a matter for Annalise, in the same way that a broken fence rail was as a matter for Phoebe. Each daughter had her domain. She placed the quarterly accounts on his desk. She put the letter back exactly as she had found it. She went back to the kitchen to supervise the ordering of the winter salt cod, because they were running low, and November was coming, and in Hartfall, November waited for no one's domestic arrangements to resolve themselves. She did not permit herself, even in the privacy of her own thoughts, to wonder what it might feel like to be the daughter someone came to choose. I want to tell you about Lord Griffith Caulfield now, because it is important that you understand him correctly before I tell you what he did. He was 33 years old, and an earl, and his family's estate at Caulfield Park had been quietly hemorrhaging money since his father's death 4 years prior. His father had been a man of large appetites and small attention to consequence, and what he had left behind was beautiful and encumbered. 200 tenant family, 3 farms that needed new drainage work, a roof on the east wing that wept in February, and debts his solicitors described, with admirable restraint, as significant. Griffith had spent 4 years trying to manage it. He had sold the townhouse, he had let the hunting box, he had reduced the household staff by 1/3 and endured the county's sympathy with a composure that cost him considerably more than he generally permitted himself to examine. What he needed was a specific kind of capital, the kind that arrived reliably from a well-managed source over a sustained period of years, not a single sum, income. His solicitor, Mr. Bryce, had been the one to find Bernard Redmayne's timber holdings during the routine review of the Redmayne family's assets, and it was Mr. Bryce who had read the will carefully, more carefully, it would emerge, than anyone in the Redmayne family itself had managed, and come to Griffith with the numbers and with the specific language, the eldest daughter, upon her marriage, Miss Phoebe Redmayne. The contract he had negotiated named a daughter of Sir Percival Redmayne's household, which was technically and deliberately imprecise. He had left it imprecise on purpose. He wanted to arrive without the full weight of his intentions declared before he had any understanding of the people involved. He was not a romantic man, he was a practical one. But he had also spent 4 years watching his tenants' well-being, e.g. by small degrees, while he held things together with insufficient means. And he had arrived at the firm conviction that entering a marriage with no knowledge of the person you were marrying was simply poor management. He preferred, when possible, to look before committing. He arrived in Hartfall 2 days before his scheduled visit, registering at the Stag and Lantern as Mr. Caulfield, no title attached. The innkeeper was a communicative man, and by the second cup of tea Griffith had learned a good deal, that Thornwick Hall was a fine estate, somewhat gone to seed, that Sir Percival was a charming man whose charm had never once prevented him from losing money, and that the Redmayne daughters were, respectively, the prettiest girl in the county and the one who kept whole thing running, though you'd never know it from the way the father talks. Griffith noted this. The following morning he rose before full light and walked the lane running along the north boundary of the Thornwick estate. He had always thought more clearly in motion, and the air in Hartfall that October morning had the particular sharp clarity that he associated with useful thinking. He saw her first at the fence line, in the long grey half-light before proper sunrise. She was speaking with an older man, one of the tenant farmers by the look of his coat, mud to the knee, cap in hand, the posture of a person explaining something difficult to someone he hoped would understand. She was listening with the whole of her attention, which is rarer than people suppose, and immediately visible when you actually encounter it. She asked a question. She wrote something in the small notebook she carried. She looked at what she had written, asked something else, then reached into her coat pocket and produced a small purse from which she counted out, with matter-of-fact precision, several coins which she pressed into the man's hand and held there for a moment when he tried to return them. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 minutes. She walked back toward the house, with the same unhurried purpose with which she had come, and she did not look back, and the old farmer stood watching her go with the expression of a man who is quietly and profoundly relieved. Griffith walked on. He was not entirely certain what he had just witnessed, or rather, he was certain, The difficulty was that it was considerably more significant than he had expected it to be. He saw her again that afternoon, quite by accident, when he took the footpath through the old birchwood at the edge of the property, and came around a bend to find two women seated on a stone bench in conversation. He stopped. The path was narrow, and the birches were thick, and he acknowledged to himself with some discomfort, standing close enough to hear every word. He should have made his presence known immediately. He did not. The dark-haired one, strong-featured in the way that gets called plain by people who are not paying attention, was saying, in the low, even tone of someone who has said same thing many times without result, "Marriage is not a performance, Annalise. It does not conclude at the altar." The honey-haired one, and she was genuinely lovely, in the clear, unfiltered afternoon light, exactly as described, waved this aside with a small gloved hand. "You are determined to make this gloomy, Phoebe. He is an earl. He will clear father's debts, which is what we need. I shall have a proper establishment at last. And if he is occasionally tedious, I shall develop a great many interests that take me out of the drawing-room. And if he is unkind, then I shall manage him the way I manage everything inconvenient," Annalise replied pleasantly and without apparent irony. At a distance, with good manners. Phoebe, truly, one cannot afford to be particular. Phoebe was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice held a quality Griffith found difficult to name. Not bitterness, not exactly, but something older than bitterness, the tone of someone who has held a true thing up to the light, so many times that it has worn smooth, without once succeeding in making anyone else see it. "A good estate," she said carefully and without hurry, "is not the house itself. It is not the grounds or the portraits in the hall or the silver in the sideboard. A good estate is the people living within it and the quality of regard they receive in return. You can have every material comfort and still be, at the very center of your own life, in a place where no one has ever once thought to ask whether you are well. I think that is the loneliest kind of poverty there is, and I would not enter a house, however grand the address, without first understanding the person I would share it with, considered such questions worth asking." "You are impossibly particular," Annalise said, with a tolerant affection of someone who has long given up expecting change. "For someone who has never had the luxury of being particular." "Yes," said Phoebe very quietly. "Well." They rose together and walked back toward the house, and their voices faded among the birches, and Griffith Caulfield stood alone on the path with his hands in his coat pockets and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has just heard something true, said plainly that he had come to Hartfall to find a wife, and had, in the space of one overheard October afternoon, already done so. He arrived at nakeable air of a woman, on the appointed morning under his proper name and title, and stepped down from his carriage to find the Redmayne household assembled with the careful arrangement of people who have been positioning themselves for some considerable time. Sir Percival, red-faced with relief. Lady Redmayne, twisting her handkerchief. Annalise positioned with a slightly too perfect nonchalance, the nonchalance of a young woman who has spent the morning rehearsing exactly how to stand. In a dress the color of old roses that suited her enormously, and behind her, in the plain dark grey of her everyday clothes, carrying nothing, wearing the expression of a woman who expects to shortly be excused to attend to the luncheon. Phoebe Redmayne. Griffith acknowledged Sir Percival. He acknowledged Lady Redmayne. He received Annalise's perfectly calibrated curtsy with a courtesy that gave her, I am told, a small and uncomfortable sense that she was being read rather than simply admired, which was accurate enough, and which she found considerably more unsettling than straightforward attention would have been. Then he turned, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided on a course and does not intend to be moved from it, and said, "Miss Phoebe Redmayne." It was not a question. Phoebe, who had not expected to be addressed at all, and was mentally reviewing whether the fire in the east sitting room had been properly laid, met his gaze with the composed surprise of a woman who is startled, but will not entirely show it. "Your lordship, I have reviewed the late Mr. Bernard Redmayne's estate documents in some detail," Griffith said, and his voice, though quiet, reached every ear in that motionless hall with the clarity of a man accustomed to being heard. "The income from his timber holdings is specified, by the terms of his will, to be released upon the marriage of the eldest daughter of this house. You are the eldest daughter of this house, Miss Redmayne. I came here to conclude an arrangement. I came here to conclude it with you. I have witnessed a good many silences across the years, and I have learned to distinguish among them. There is the silence of comprehension, which settles quickly and breeds a kind of calm. There is the silence of shock, which is noisier than it appears. You can hear within it the sound of every assumption collapsing simultaneously. This was the second kind. Sir Percival's face moved through several distinct shades. Lady Redmayne sat down on the hall bench without quite intending to, and Annalise stood very still, and to her genuine credit, for I have not made her a villain in this telling, and I do not intend to. What moved across her face was not calculation, but something rawer and more difficult. The pain of a young woman who has been informed, kindly, and without personal malice, that the asset she has spent her entire life developing was not, as it turned out, what the market required. And Phoebe Redmayne looked at the Earl of Caulfield and understood in one perfectly suspended moment that the imprecision in his contract had not been an accident. "You knew," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it. "Before you ever came here, you knew which daughter the inheritance named." "I knew which daughter the will named," Griffith said, just as quietly. "I did not know before this week which daughter I would wish to marry. Those turned out to be the same woman. But I want you to understand that the decision I made was not made for me by a solicitor in Edinburgh." She looked at him for a long moment, with the direct, unhurried attention that he was already learning was simply her face when she was being genuinely present. He found it, he would later admit, considerably more unnerving than hostility would have been. "If you would permit me," he said, "I would like to speak with you privately, at a time convenient to yourself." She was quiet for half a breath. It was, perhaps, those last 4 words that made the decision for her. At a time convenient to yourself. She was not, as a general rule, the person whose convenience was consulted. "The estate accounts room," she said, after luncheon. He was there at 2 o'clock. The room was small and practical, with a single north-facing window and 3 long shelves of ledgers going back at least 12 years. The handwriting in the most recent volumes was the same throughout, consistent, unhurried, entirely familiar to anyone who had been paying the slightest attention. He did not need to ask whose hand it was. Phoebe came in at 2 minutes past, sat across from him without ceremony, and looked at him in the manner of a woman who is ready to hear whatever he has come to say. He told her everything. He told her about the debts at Caulfield Park, with the specific figures, because he had found that abstract obligations are easier to dismiss than precise ones, and he did not want her dismissing them. He told her about the tenant families, the Henrys on the North Farm, old Mrs. Hollis in the gatehouse who had lived there for 40 years, the Colbert brothers whose drainage ditch had finally collapsed in August, because he found that named people were harder to set aside than unnamed burdens. He told her about his father, briefly and without self-pity, because the point was not his father, but the situation his father had produced. He told her about coming to Hartfall 2 days early. He told her about the fence line at dawn, and the old farmer, and the purse produced without hesitation or performance. He told her about the birchwood path, and he did not soften what he had done there. Standing in the trees listening to a conversation he had not been invited to hear, because he had turned it over all night and could find no version of the telling that did not require him to say simply, "I stood and listened, and I am not comfortable with that, and I cannot claim the method was admirable, only that what it showed me was." "You heard what I said," Phoebe said. not a question. I heard what you said about the loneliest kind of poverty. He looked at her directly. I have been living in the vicinity of that observation for 4 years without having words for it. Hearing it named was clarifying. And if I had said something quite different, if I had said what my sister said, then I would have sat across from you to complete an arrangement that served the practical requirements of 2 families, and I would have expected nothing beyond that, and I would have been honest about expecting nothing. The terms of the will would not have changed. He paused. I am not offering you sentiment as a substitute for an accurate account of what this arrangement is. It is practical, it has a financial basis. I want you to understand that I am clear on that. I also want you to know that I would very much prefer it to become something more if you are willing, and that I have not manufactured that preference for your benefit. I had it when I walked out of those trees. Phoebe was quiet for a long moment, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone working through a calculation that deserves genuine care. Then she said, I need one day. Of course. Not because I am uncertain of the material facts. I understand those clearly. She met his eyes. I need one day because I am 26 years old and I have been arranging other people's lives for 9 years. And I want to be certain that when I give my answer, it is mine and not simply the relief of being asked. He left her to it. He went back to the Stag and Lantern, ate a supper he barely tasted, and read until he could no longer make sense of the page. He acknowledged stakeable air of a woman. Somewhere around 10 o'clock, that he had not been genuinely anxious about an outcome since the first winter after his father's death, when the roof on the east wing had been leaking and he had not yet found the means to repair it. This felt worse than the roof, and rather more important. She came to the inn the following morning at 9:30, walking alone across the high street in the same grey coat, her breath showing faint in the October air. She asked the innkeeper for the private sitting room, which was provided without delay by a man who had apparently decided, from the bearing of a woman who knows exactly where she is going, that this was not a request to be kept waiting. Griffith rose when she entered. She sat. She looked at him for a moment, with the open, direct regard that he had already come to understand was simply how she looked when she was telling the truth. I have one thing to say before I answer, she said. I want you to hear it as information, not as a condition. All right. I am not the woman you may have assembled in your mind from a morning at a fence line and an overheard conversation in a birchwood. She said it without apology. I am not steady by nature. I am steady by necessity, which is an entirely different thing. I have been managing this household since my mother's long illness when I was 17, and I have been good at it because the alternative was that things fell apart and people suffered, not because I possess some particular gift for selflessness. She paused. I am often tired. I am frequently impatient. I have strong opinions about drainage systems, about the correct timing for preserving autumn stores, and about the sort of person who mistakes a woman's competence for contentment. I have not once been asked, in my own home, whether I am content myself. I would like, in whatever arrangement follows this conversation, to be occasionally asked. Griffith was quiet for a moment. I am not steady by nature either, he said. I am reserved by habit which people routinely mistake for coldness. I find most social occasions an exercise in endurance. I have strong opinions about soil composition and accounting practices, and the particular short-sightedness of anyone who neglects a drainage system in clay country. A pause. I would like, in whatever follows, to be occasionally disagreed with by someone who has actually done the reading. Phoebe looked at him, and something in her expression, the composed, capable, carefully maintained expression of a woman who had spent 9 years being useful without being seen, finally allowed itself to do something unfamiliar. It became simply and entirely honest. Yes, she said, my answer is yes. Not because he was an earl, not because Caulfield Park was by all accounts a very fine house with sound bones and a roof that needed attention. Not because her father's debts would be settled and her own uncertain future suddenly clarified. All of those things were real, and she was too practical a person to pretend otherwise. She said yes, because he'd had come to her with the numbers and the names and the specific truth of his situation, and had then sat quietly while she asked him difficult questions, and had answered without performance, because he had told her without being asked, that he had stood in a birchwood and listened, and was not proud of it, and had found it necessary anyway, and found what it showed him to be true. Because when he spoke of his tenants, he named them. She said yes, because the man sitting across the table was tired in approximately the way she was tired, and honest in approximately the way she was honest, and she had been sitting across from people her entire adult life, without anyone, once, sitting back. Before I let you go tonight, I want to tell you about Annalise, because she deserves a proper ending and not merely a footnote. She wept in private for the better part of a day. I will not diminish that. A young woman who has been given every indication that her face is her chief currency does not easily absorb the news that the transaction she had prepared for has been conducted entirely without her. She wept, and Phoebe sat with her through the worst of it, which tells you a considerable amount about who Phoebe Redmayne actually was. But Annalise was not at her foundation a fragile creature. She was a clever and adaptable one, and once the weeping had passed, she looked at her situation with considerably clearer eyes and discovered something she had not previously given herself credit for. She was funny. Genuinely, warmly, unaffectedly funny. The young man she eventually married, a cheerful landowner from the next county, unpretentious and frankly besotted, loved her for precisely that quality, and never once made her feel that her face was a currency with an expiration date. She was, in that marriage, something she had not anticipated being, entirely herself. For some temperaments, that is the better ending, and there is not the smallest shame in it. I will leave them there, at the beginning rather than the end, which is where most stories worth telling are most alive. What I will say before you go is this. Sir Percival Redmayne had 2 daughters, and he sorted them as parents sometimes will, very early and without much examination, one into the category of valuable, one into the category of useful. He built 9 years of a household, and a marriage negotiation on top of that unchecked assumption, without once pausing to ask whether he had read the situations accurately. It took a stranger, a man with no history in that house, no investment in how its rooms had always been understood, to arrive, look at both daughters with fresh eyes, and see in 2 mornings of honest observation what 9 years of proximity had obscured. I think about this rather often, my dear listeners, about how long familiarity can become its own particular blindness, about how we file people into the folders we assigned them years ago and then mistake the folder for the person, about how often the one doing the most essential work in any given room is the one we have stopped seeing, precisely because they have never once stopped showing up. Look around you, not at the loudest person in the room, nor the most immediately striking one. Look at the person who has been quietly keeping things functional, whose reliability has become so consistent that it has been reclassified in everyone's mind as simply the way things are. Ask yourself when you last looked past the function to the person holding it up. They have been standing there, in all likelihood, considerably longer than you realize. If you've been sitting with me tonight here at Moonlight, at Ravenwood, and find you would like to stay by this fire a while longer, the membership button sits just below this video. It costs very little, and I am always glad to know who is in the room. And if you are not quite ready for that, well, I have told you about a man who stood in a birchwood and listened to a woman name the loneliest kind of poverty she knew. I have told you about a woman who spent 9 years being the mechanism by which a household remained standing, without anyone troubling to ask whether the mechanism was Wells. I will not pretend they did not deserve, both of them, exactly what they found at the other end of that particular autumn. Subscribe to Moonlight at Ravenwood and come back to me. There are a great many more of these, and I should very much hate for you to miss a single one. Good night, and if you happen to know someone who has been sorted, quietly and long ago, into the category of merely useful, perhaps tell them tonight that you see them. It costs you nothing, and it may be for them precisely everything.